Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Mona Shah. Today I'm going to talk about constructor, types of constructor and destructor. What is a constructor? A constructor is a member function of a class. The name of a constructor is the same as the class name. A constructor is involved in the task of initializing the data members of an object of a class automatically when an object of the class is created. Which means that as soon as the class object is created, the constructor gets called implicitly. As the name of the constructor is the same as the name of the class, it is called as special member function. This special member function cannot return any value. Let us take an example. We have class A here. Class A has a member variable small a. In the public section, we have a member function called get. The constructor of the class with the same name as the class is defined outside the class. As we said in the definition, that constructor is used to initialize the data members of the class. Within the constructor, in this example, the data member small a gets initialized to 10. In the get function, we return the value which was initialized earlier. In the main function, we create an object A1 of class A. The constructor at this point gets called automatically and it will initialize value for the small data member. It will initialize small a is equal to 10. When we use a1.get function call, it will display the value 10 which was initialized with the constructor. The characteristics of the constructor. The name of the constructor is the same as its class name. Constructors are mostly defined in the public section of the class. Constructors do not return any values and hence they do not have any return type. Constructors can be overloaded, which means that you can have more than one constructor for the same class with different signature. Moving further, let us talk about the types of the constructor. We have 5 types of constructors discussed here: default constructor, parameterized constructor, overloaded constructors, constructors with default values, and finally the copy constructors. Let us have a look at each of these constructors one by one, starting with the default constructor. A default constructor has 0 parameter list, or a constructor that accepts no argument is called as a 0 argument constructor or default constructor. That means this constructor will have no arguments or no parameter list. Examples always serve better to understand the underlying concepts. So we shall here again take an example. We have class A over here, which has 2 data members, small a and small b. Then we have the constructor for the class A. Within the constructor, in the definition of the constructor, which is outside the class, we have a display of the string which says I am the default constructor, and it initializes the 2 member variables a is equal to 10 and b is equal to 20. Then we have the get member function for the class A, which would display the values for the data members a and b. Going to the main function, we create an object A1 of class A. The constructor for this object gets called, and hence it will display the string I am the default constructor. Initialize the value of the data member A is equal to 10, B is equal to 20. When there is a function call for the get function, it will display those values, and that brings us to the end of the default constructors. Moving further, the next category of the constructor is parameterized constructor. The constructor which takes argument during the object creation are called as parameterized constructor. Within the class A, we have two data members, A and B. In the public section, we have the constructor for this class with two integer arguments, and we have a member function get. Within the constructor of this class, we are initializing the value for both the data members A and B. A shall take the value of X, B shall take the value of the former argument Y. Within the get function, we are displaying the values of A and B which were earlier initialized. In the main function, we create an object A1 of class A with two parameters with two arguments 10 and 20, which means that at this stage the constructor for this class will be called, and the data member A shall be initialized to 10 and the data member B shall be initialized to 20. In the second line of the main function, we are again creating another object A2 for the same class A. Here the argument passed are 20 and 10, which means that for the object A2, when the constructor gets called at this stage, the data member A shall be initialized to value 20 and the data member B shall be initialized to 10. When there is a call to the get function, for the object A1, it would display the values which were earlier initialized during the object creation for A and B. That means A1.get function call will display 10 and 20, and the function call A2.get will display 20 and 10. Let us understand what are overloaded constructors. Overloaded constructors are multiple constructors defined with different argument list. Earlier we have talked about the concept of overloaded functions. When you have multiple functions in the same class with the same name but with different signature or different arguments, the concept is termed as overloaded functions. Here we are going to talk about overloaded constructors. That means that we will have more than one constructor for the same class but with different signature. The example over here has a class A. In the public section, we have two constructors. The first constructor has two integer argument or takes two integer arguments, and the second constructor takes only one integer argument. Moving towards the definition of the first constructor with two integer arguments, it would display the string constructor with two arguments and the values initialized with X and Y. In the second constructor with one argument, there will be a display of string saying that constructor with one argument and shall be initialized with the value X. In the main function, we can see that we are creating an object A with two arguments 15, 15, which means that the constructor with two arguments will be called. The value of X shall be 15, the value of Y shall also be 15. The string displayed will be constructor with two arguments. Had we created another object in this particular code with only one argument, it would have created that object with one argument and the constructor with one argument would be called. Let us talk about constructor with default arguments. Now the basic concept over here is if the user does not give the required argument, then this constructor would assume a default argument and go ahead with the operation of constructor. So in a parameterized constructor, the arguments are assigned with default values for some or all of the formal argument which does not have any matching argument in the parameterized constructor call. So when that argument does not match, those default values which are supplied shall be taken and will be called as default arguments. This allows a call to a parameterized constructor without assigning all its argument. So the user may assign those arguments, may not assign those arguments. If the arguments are assigned by the users, those shall be considered. Otherwise, the default arguments will be taken up. So if no value is passed for any of the argument when the constructor is called, the default value specified in the constructor prototype is passed. If all the arguments are passed by the user, then the parameterized constructor gets called and the default values are ignored. Now let us take an example. We have a class A over here. We have a variable add. In the public section, I have the constructor of the class. It has two arguments. Both of them are integers. The second argument is a default argument. That means that if the user does not supply the second argument, it shall be considered as 10 and the rest of the operation is carried out. Moving to the constructor definition, we have two arguments x and y. X shall be supplied by the user. Y also can be supplied by the user, but if it is not supplied, it shall be taken as 10. In the constructor, we are going to add the two arguments x and y and display the summation. Let's go to the main program. I am creating one object called A1. In the first line, I am passing two arguments 5 and 11. The requirement of the constructor over here is two arguments and both the arguments are supplied by the user. So the need of two arguments is completed in the first argument. So 11 plus 5, 16 would be displayed when the first constructor for object A1 is called. Now again in the second call, the object A1 is created again but with only one argument. The requirement of the constructor is two arguments but the user has given one argument, but we do have a default argument. So the second argument shall be considered as 10. The addition will be 6 plus 10, 16, which shall be displayed in the second case. So in both the cases are absolutely valid. In the first case, we have supplied two arguments and it works. In the second case, we have supplied one argument and still it works. So that is all about the constructor with default arguments. Let us take a typical case of overloading. We have a class A. In the public section, I have one constructor with no arguments and the second constructor with default arguments. That means the first constructor does not require any argument, and when the first constructor without any argument gets called, the string I am in zero argument constructor gets displayed. In the second case with the default argument, that means if the user supplies argument, it is well and good, but if the user does not supply the argument, it shall be assumed as 0. In that case, it is going to display this string I am in a parameterized constructor. Moving to the main function, you can see over here that we are creating an object A1 of class A. Now, which of the constructor shall be called is an interesting case over here. The listener of this slides needs to think about it, that which constructor will be called and why. There shall be a conflict that both the constructors are equally liable to be called over here. So which shall be called? I am leaving it to the users to ponder upon this issue, and we shall take it up in the next class. Moving to the next constructor, we have a copy constructor. This constructor is used to initialize the members of a newly created object by copying the members of the already existing object into the members of newly created object. The process of initializing the members of object through a copy constructor is known as copy initialization. In this example, we have a class called code. ID is the data member. In the public section, we have init member function, which initializes the value of the variable ID. In the display section, we are displaying the value of ID. Moving to the main function, obj1 is the object for this particular code. So, in the next line, we have obj1.init5, which will initialize the value of the ID is equal to 5. When we call display function, that value will be displayed. The next line, which says that code obj2 is equal to obj1, is nothing but calling of the copy constructor. Code obj2, that means we are creating a new object. The name of this object is obj2. It belongs to the class code, and the value of this obj2 is equal to obj1. So the data members of obj1 shall be copied to obj2. With the code obj2.display, the contents of obj2, that means the ID variable, shall be displayed. Now we are going to talk about destructor. A destructor is a special member function just like the constructor. The name of the destructor again is the same as the class name, but it is preceded with a tilde character, and it is involved in the automatic destruction of the objects that were created in the constructor. Through the constructor, we have created new objects and we have initialized the member variables. In this example of a destructor, we have a class A, we have a member X. In the public section, I have a constructor and I have a destructor. Within the constructor, I am going to display this string constructor called, and the value of the data member gets initialized. In the destructor, the string destructor call shall be displayed. We have one more member function called get, which will return the value of A. Let us go to the main function, where we are creating an object A1 of class A with the value 5. Which means that the data member of the object A1 will be initialized with the value 5. With A1.get function call, that value shall be displayed. We are creating another object A2 with the value 10, and with A2.get it shall get displayed. So here we see that there is no implicit call to the destructor. They are called automatically. It's the characteristic of a destructor. So a destructor is invoked automatically by the compiler, which we saw in the last example, when its corresponding constructor goes out of the scope and releases the memory which is no longer required. Destructor will not return any value and not accept any argument, and therefore a destructor cannot be overloaded. A destructor cannot be declared as constant, static or volatile. A destructor should be declared in the public section, and a destructor is always called in the reverse order of its invocation. That means that if I am creating an object in the order of A1 and A2 and A3, Then the destructor will be called in the reverse order. That means the destructor for A3 will be called first, then the destructor for A2 will be called, and then the destructor for A1 will be called. This brings us to the end of today's session. Hope you enjoyed the session. Hope you had the basic information of constructor and destructor. Thank you so much and enjoy the e-learning.